I'm sorry. Okay, we're good.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. We are really glad to have you. I'm Gabrielle. I am on the board of the LEAD Club, leading ethically, and I'm sorry, I can't remember, but it's just like a long acronym, but it's a LEAD Club. It's a group that's focused on leadership at Lehman. We are accepting members, so please, if you're interested, definitely just send me an email or write it in the chat, and we can plug you into joining our club. So for today, we have Dr. Ciulla. She is a pioneer in the field of leadership ethics. Her research on the ethical challenges of leadership is interdisciplinary, but draws heavily on literature in philosophy and history. She also does extensive research in business ethics. Prior to joining Rutgers, she held the Costin Family Chair in Leadership and Ethics at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond, where she was one of the founding faculty of the school, which is the first degree granting liberal arts school of leadership studies in the world. Ciulla has held academic appointments at Harvard Business School, the Wharton School, LaSalle University, and numerous visiting appointments outside of the US, including the UNESCO Chair in Leadership Studies at the United Nations International Leadership Academy in Jordan. She is a Fulbright specialist, which allows her work with institutions outside of the US on programs and research related to ethics and leadership. Ciulla sits on the editorial boards of the Business Ethics Quarterly, the Leadership Quarterly, and Leadership. She edits the New Horizons in Leadership Studies series, which is one of the largest collections of books from the humanities and the social sciences on leadership. Ciulla has served as the former president of the Society for Business Ethics and the International Society for Business Ethics and Economics. She has also worked with the Aspen Institute and the Brookings Institution and has given lectures and seminars to business and government organizations all over the world. So join me in welcoming Dr. Ciulla.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And I see some hands. I'll clap for you too. Lovely to be with my friends up in the Bronx. And I'm down here in Midtown. And actually, what I see when I look out my window, I'm right next to the United Nations, which is probably appropriate because I travel so much. Anyway, I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian. I know this is supposed to be about empathy, but I'm a philosopher and we never agree with anything. That's just what we do. And it's why people sometimes try to poison us with hemlock like they did with Socrates. So I'm going to talk about empathy and care. And if you'll bear with me, I'll put my slides up and we'll get started. My cover screen is actually a photograph my husband took once when we were in Rome and there was about to be a thunderstorm over the forum. But what you'll see from my talk is it's quite relevant to what I'm talking about because I'm going to be talking about the Emperor Nero in my talk. So empathy and care. I want to talk about these two concepts, particularly in regard to ethical leadership. So let's just start with empathy. So we know if we think of empathy as a moral principle, the closest we come to it in terms of a widespread moral principle is the golden rule. And the golden rule, as you all know, is do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Now, this rule requires that you know what you like and care about and feel, and you make the assumption that other people are the same. So it's a kind of reverse of empathy. It's not empathy we usually think of as how we understand how other people feel. And this is about how you project what you feel into other people. So there's the golden rule, and that is in a positive sense. And then there's what's called the silver rule. And the silver rule is used in many different cultures. As a matter of fact, if you ever read any Confucius uses it. And that is basically, do not do to others what you would not want them to do to you. And it's kind of interesting to look at them because the silver rule is more of a moral minimum, just saying, I know what I don't like, so I assume you don't like it either. Whereas the golden rule is more prescriptive. It says, well, I know what I like, and I can assume that other people like what I like. It's an interesting nuance, but an important one. And the reason why I bring up the golden rule and the silver rule is that there have been studies on the golden rule, and it shows up in 64 different cultures in various renditions. So people say it in different ways and frame it in different ways. But what it boils down to is one way we know how to treat people is by how we like to be treated. But of course, we know there's some anomalies with that. So for example, if you're a masochist and you love being beaten, to apply the golden rule to other people is going to be highly problematic. So empathy is related to the golden rule in an interesting kind of way. But let's look at empathy. So we think I'm giving a very simple definition of it: the ability to understand the feelings of others. Now, empathy isn't always a positive notion. And I would say from a normative point of view, I'm not sure it's really a moral principle per se. So let's look at the good side of it. The positive side of empathy is we usually think it's what motivates people to behave ethically, and certainly the case in leaders. You understand how other people feel and you want to do well by them. A lot of people think that empathy makes people kinder. An empathetic person usually we kind of think of as a kind person. And we also think that empathy might make a leader caring. If he knows how followers feel, or she knows how followers feel, she'll pay attention and she'll be attentive, etc., to their feelings. But there's a negative side to empathy, especially in regard to leadership. First of all, empathy is subjective. So it has to do with your feelings. So I might be a sensitive person who is empathetic to other people. And maybe as a leader, that's going to be good for me and good for my followers, but I might not be. And that is really up to the individual. I'm also I'm very suspicious of moral concepts that involve feelings, because feelings are variable and they're very idiosyncratic. So I'm going to want to look at that one closely. Empathy does not mean that you're going to take moral actions. I'll give you a simple example. So I walk to the Penn Station when I go to work, and I see a homeless person who looks miserable and perhaps looks like they have some other kinds of problems. I feel really bad. I empathize, especially if it's cold out. It's like, oh my God, sitting in that cold. Well, I mean, one thing I might try to do is I might give the person some money. Another thing I might do is maybe I'll go to a policeman and say, you know, it's really cold out. Maybe you should see if this person can get to a warm place. So I might intervene in some sort of way. On the other hand, I may not always do something good. I may decide not to walk that way anymore because it's so upsetting to see that person in such pain and struggling. So you can't say that empathy is a necessary, nor necessarily or a sufficient condition for moral behavior. And that's how it can impede moral action. So leaders who are always dependent on their feelings or empathy could be in trouble because they could get distracted by them. And so I want to talk about some stronger moral concepts that get at what I think we commonly understand as the good things that empathy gives us, the stuff on the positive side. So I want to talk about care. And care is generally defined as to be attentive or to pay attention to people and to behave in a way that shows an interest or a concern for the well-being of others. It's used in many ways. So for example, care can be a feeling, I care about you. But care can also be a duty. I have a duty to care about you. Care can be an expression of feeling, I care for you. I mean, if you think of all the ways we use it linguistically, care is an interesting notion. But I'm interested in care as a moral concept. And I have this little quote down at the bottom because care comes from the Latin word cura, or cure, like the word cure. So caring for someone is related to curing someone in a peculiar way. And I'm going to exploit that a little bit in a minute. But he says that, Ciulla in the Roman mythology is someone who helps to create human beings and watches over them over time, watches over them to make sure their well-being is good. So I want to talk about care, which is often considered an extension of empathy, and have empathy actually play a somewhat more minor role. Now, the way I'm going to do it is through a historical example. Now, you've probably heard the expression, Nero fiddled while Rome burned. It's a very common expression. And here we have a little picture of Nero. It's probably one of the strangest stories in ancient history. And I'm going to tell you the story, and we'll see how that's related to care. Because one of the things about the story is it tells us something about how leaders show care. And showing care is in some ways more important than saying, I care about you. So what does this mean to show care? Well, if we looked at some of the psychological writings on care, for example, Erik Erikson, he says, if a baby's crying in the other room, you don't yell from the living room, they're there, everything's going to be okay. What you do is you usually you pick the baby up and you cuddle the baby, right? So care has something to do with physical presence. And I want to talk about it in regard to physical presence in times of crises as a way in which leaders often most manifest their notions of care. And just to put in the back of your mind, we've been watching the war in the Ukraine unfold. The presence of the Ukrainian leader is highly significant and important, and he seems to have a very good grasp of what I'm going to talk about. So let me tell you the story about Nero. So Nero was an emperor. He was kind of an awful guy. He was a cousin of Caligula, so he had not a very nice family. And one of the first things he did when he became emperor, to show you how tough he is he killed his mother. He had his mother killed. Her name was Agrippa, and apparently she sort of deserved it because she wasn't very nice either. But anyway, so Nero historically has this horrible reputation as being this awful guy. And the expression bread and circuses comes from Nero, because the way he kept the underclasses happy is he would have people fight wild animals in the Colosseum, and all the masses could go to it, and they get this great gruesome entertainment, and he would give them free bread. And that's how he kept them happy. So that's the rap on Nero. Whether it's really true is a whole other story. Anyway, in 64 AD, there was a huge fire in Rome. And Nero was down the coast at his coast house and his summer house. And they came down and said, Rome's burning. And so he said, well, he wasn't ready to move. And then they said, well, yeah, but it's going to burn your palace up too. So he hightailed it up to Rome. Now, let me read you something from the Roman historian Tacitus. So he describes it this way. So Nero comes up to Rome, and he does exactly what a mayor of the city would do. So he comes up, he opens up the parks and some of the monuments, and he even opens up his own garden so people could put up tents and stuff and stay in there. He freezes the price of grain, so there's no price gouging going on. He does all these kinds of things that you would do in a crisis, that FEMA does when there's an emergency. However, Tacitus says, these things were all very popular, but when this happened, a rumor started spreading through the city that as the city was burning, he actually went to his palace, mounted his domestic stage, and wrote a song about the fire and sang it. Now, that's about the wackiest story you'd ever want to hear in history. So what's going on there? So they say it's a rumor. Another historian, Suetonius, says Nero watched the fire from the Tower of Maecenas, and enraptured by what he called the beauty of the flames, he then put on his tragedian costume and sang the Sack of Ilium from beginning to end. He offered to remove the corpses and rubble free of charge, but allowed nobody to search among the ruins, even of his own mansion. He wanted to collect as much loot and spoils as possible himself. Then he opened the Fire Relief Fund and insisted on contributions, which bled the provincials white and practically bankrupted private citizens. So imagine someone talking about a leader like this. Here's a leader, goes into a crisis, does what you're supposed to do in the crisis, but this rumor goes on. I'm not interested in whether the story is true. It's written about by a whole bunch of historians. I mean, there was a fire in Rome in 64 AD. What I'm really interested in is what does the story tell us? And a lot of my research has been historical because I'm interested in looking at the themes that come up about ethics and leadership again and again throughout history. Well, part of what the story tells us is nobody ever really thought Nero cared about them to begin with. And so he abuses it. There was also rumors that he set the fire in Rome because he wanted to rebuild the city. This was his way of doing urban renewal. But it's a weird story, okay? But it tells us that when leaders don't care, this kind of rumor exemplifies the fact that this guy doesn't care. Now, the expression Nero fiddled while Rome burned comes to us through, of all people, William Shakespeare, shows up in one of his plays, who says, like Nero, who fiddled when Rome burned. So it comes to mean a leader who really doesn't care or does something trivial or doesn't pay attention when there's a crisis. The word fiddled, well, first of all, he didn't fiddle because fiddles weren't invented. He plays a sitar, which is a stringed instrument. But Shakespeare sort of got it wrong, and it was fide means string in Latin, and Shakespeare kind of got it wrong. But anyway, it shows up in a Shakespeare play. Samuel Johnson gets hold of the word fiddled. And think about this. I mean, fiddled, you usually think of playing the violin, right? But Samuel Johnson also has another meaning for it, that fiddled means doing something useless or unimportant when you shouldn't be, when you should be paying attention to something else. Anyway, this image becomes a very powerful image of leaders who don't care. And then lack of care is manifested in a time of crisis where they are either doing something trivially, or I'm going to argue, are in the wrong place at the wrong time. So let's look at all of the Neros. So it's such a powerful image. Now, this is President Bush, and you see him down in the corner. He's playing a guitar. This was during Hurricane Katrina, and people felt he should have gone to New Orleans during that time, but he was at a fundraiser with a country western singer, and he was playing the guitar. So what shows up on the internet? Here he is, that horrible scene in the stadium in New Orleans, and here's Bush playing the guitar. The idea that during a crisis, leaders have to be in one of two places. They either have to be at the site of the crisis, which isn't always possible, or they usually have to go back to their office. So being at a fundraiser or on vacation doesn't work. So I did a huge study of leaders being in the wrong place. Now, I don't want to be partisan here. Here's Obama fiddling. And he was fiddling. This came out when he was putting through the healthcare law, and a lot of people thought he wasn't paying enough attention. So attentiveness is part of care, that I'm watching you, I'm seeing you. And notice it's related to empathy, but it's not really empathy. It's not, I know how you're feeling. It's, I'm paying attention to what you're feeling, even if, let's say, I don't understand it at all, or it's never happened to me, so I have a hard time imagining it. Of course, here is his Trump is Nero. Over here, I don't know if you can see on the far side, he is fiddling, and I think these are things like test tubes or something related to COVID, the idea of not being attentive when COVID is happening. So we see there's lots of different cases of leaders who are accused of this, and here going back to this ancient story of Nero. But I wanted to get to another case that I thought you would find interesting, especially because he's in the news so much, and that is the case of something that happened in 2000 with Vladimir Putin. And it's sort of profound to go back and look at my research on him back then. In 2000, a submarine called the Kursk was an atomic submarine, sank in And it was a disaster because the men were actually trapped in the submarine, and this was in the Baltic Sea. And during that time, Russia had a free press. It was sort of like a normal country in 2000, to think of how much it's changed now. But during that time, he was on vacation in Sochi in his house. If you remember, the Olympics were in Sochi as well. He was on vacation in his house at Sochi, and he refused to go up to the Barents Sea, to where there were all these families and everybody, and they were all worried. He didn't go into his office. And the international press, I want to read you some of these things from different countries all over the world. And this was before people realized how awful he really could be. But different people had the same notion about care and empathy. So I want to read you some of these from the press. One person said in the Moscow Daily, they said, "It's particularly irksome that he has not interrupted his vacation, if only for an hour, to support the seamen in distress, because he had been on a submarine before, so he must have known what it was like to be there." Then he goes on, one British newspaper, The Independent, said, "No Democratic politician can afford to remain on holiday in a crisis." And then a Norwegian newspaper wrote, "Every other democratically elected head of state would have gotten as near the site of the actual accident as humanly possible." And then a journalist named Michael Backhouse argued, he said, "The expectation that leaders care is not a new one for Russians. The czars and their Soviet successors, however, simply did not have to take care of public concerns. In their majority, the Russians still want a strong man, a kind of czar at the lead, but they also want somebody who will take care of people and who is with them in times of misery." And that statement's really important. And he goes on and says, "Putin's heartless silence and the serious shortcomings during the rescue mission could destroy his reputation as the savior of the Russian people." All of this is very ironic listening to it today, isn't it? And this is a rather profound statement, because people in times of crisis look to leaders, obviously, and they're also willing to hand over their freedom to leaders in times of crisis. So crises can be a very delicate moment for someone in a leadership position. Lastly, I wanted to read you this one other quote. When Russia had a free press, there's a radio program called Echo of Moscow that was like a call-in radio program. They said, "A survey done by Echo of Moscow heated up the switchboards. Most of the radio listeners wanted Putin to immediately interrupt his vacation," adding, "Clinton does it all the time." So it's also interesting to see that comparison. So with all of this uproar, here's Putin's response. He gave an interview to Voice of America, and he said, "The only thing I could have changed that would have changed my conduct as head of state, I could have halted my working meetings to suspend them at Sochi and go to the Black Sea or go to Moscow. But again, it would have been a PR activity, since any city in the country or all over the world, I'm always linked to the military. I have communication means I can discuss problems at the table." Well, this is kind of interesting to think of, because we haven't heard anything about him doing the things that American presidents traditionally do during times of war, which is usually meet with families of soldiers who have been slain. And that's another issue of presence that shows care. And there's another aspect of care that's kind of important in leadership, and that is these gestures. And we could say they are PR, but not all PR is bad. I mean, you do have to have a relationship with the public. But the thing about these kinds of gestures is, not only does it show care, but it also shows that that you're together, that you're part of a whole. And that it's not that there's leaders here and everyone else is here, but that your suffering is my suffering and we're together. So this was an interesting example. Now, leaders learn these things by being on the job, and Putin learned this as well. So in 2004, Chechen rebels attacked a school in Beslan, and Putin got on a plane and got there really fast. Now, the case is different because with the submarine, one suspicion of the submarine, and again, these suspicions are sort of like the Nero story, is that that was a nuclear submarine and he didn't want any help from anybody. He never got help from anyone to save these people because he had some secrets to hide there. This is a case where they're fighting Chechen rebels, so he's probably a little more comfortable, but he probably had somebody in his office saying, you have to go and meet these parents of all these slaughtered school children because a whole bunch of kids died in that thing. So here we see Putin going there and learning his lesson. And I remember watching this because I had been doing this research for a really long time. And I remember watching a clip of him meeting with him, and he looked like there was no place in the world he'd rather not be than in this place. I mean, extremely uncomfortable, extremely stiff. But here's the thing. I mean, it's about presence in leadership, is that the mere fact that he went there, even if he wasn't Mr. Warm and Fuzzy, was significant. And it's true across the board. So when Katrina hit New Orleans, Bush said, oh, I didn't go because it would cause too much trouble. And yes, that's a practical concern. Putin says, I have all sorts of communication with my military, so I'm being practical. I don't need to go there. But they have to understand they need to go. It's the only physical manifestation we have of care, because saying I care does not mean anything in these situations. So Putin, I think, kind of learned his lesson, and some people learn it on the job. So here's the last part of my argument, and that is that I think when we look at care, we can think of it as a feeling, but what's highly significant is the notion of care as a duty. And from a moral point of view, what's most important for leaders is to feel a duty to care, which includes things like attentiveness. And you may not really understand how people are feeling, but you can know how people are feeling. You may not be able to feel how they're feeling, but you know how they are. But the duty is to be attentive and present in both a physical sense and a metaphorical sense. And so even if people don't go to the sites of disasters, during Katrina, for example, if he had left the fund, they knew Katrina was going to hit, by the way, they had all this knowledge, and he still went to a fundraiser in California. If he had gone back to his office, it would have said, I'm here, I'm the leader. It's kind of interesting that, you know, the Queen of England, whenever she's in her castle, the flag is flying on top. People want to know where their leaders are, and particularly in times of crisis. So talking about England, so here we have Princess Di and the Queen. And so feeling care and the duty to care. So ideally, you should have a feeling of care for people, but not everybody can do that. But a duty to care works well too. So if you look at these two characters in terms of the kinds of public perceptions of them, what made people so excited about Diana is they had a sense she felt care, and she did her duties to care, whether it's, you know, visiting the sick or whatever. Whereas the Queen, I don't know if people have a strong sense that she feels care, and she may well, I think she probably does feel care, but what they admire about her is a duty to care. So what does this mean when you think about practical leadership roles that you might find yourselves in? Is, first of all, understanding presence, what that means, understanding the notion of attentiveness, and how you manifest that. Showing up in crises is an exceedingly important part of leadership. And lastly, we'll end with Seneca. He said, we're given reason so we can achieve the good. So following your duties involves certainly reason. But the idea that you use your reason to know what your duty is one thing. He said, we're given the capacity to care. And so we're given that capacity to care so we can perfect the good. And so Seneca sort of understood that you need both the emotion and the notion of reason of what it means to have your duty. And just one last thought on Seneca. Seneca was Nero's tutor. So if you ever want to feel like a failure as a teacher, Seneca might have been one of those people. But yes, he was Nero's teacher. He was a Stoic philosopher. But this notion I've been doing a lot of work lately on emotions and ethics. And it's a tricky one because you need emotions for ethics, and emotions are very much a part of ethics, so we can't deny them, but we have to sort of understand how they work with ethics. And when it comes to leadership, I think the most fundamental thing before everything else is understanding what your duties are. And if your duties are to be attentive, you don't have to necessarily be warm and fuzzy, but you definitely have to have that presence that people need, and that certainly is part of what your job is. So with that, I'll stop and we can have some discussion about all this. I'll get my slides off here. Here we go. There we go.
Thank you for that, Dr. Ciulla. I think you make a really excellent point in terms of care and leadership. And it really gave me a different perspective on when we have people in leadership roles and the idea of the duty to care, especially during times of crisis. Like, what are their responses? What does that look like? And how do we move forward from that? And also connecting it in terms of the politics, right? So when we're looking at politicians, we're looking at them and we're kind of sizing them up during their campaigns, right? Does this person seem empathetic to our situations or in the community? What are their responses to the community? How do they approach the community? And that kind of idea of duty to care, right? What does that look like when you have somebody who's trying, running for a political position? So your points about obviously our presidents, past and present, what that looks like, really just kind of struck a chord with me. I'm really thinking in terms of like my larger project, how I can utilize some of that information. So I appreciate that. We're going to start with some of our questions. So we have from Lauren. She just asked if you can share a time where you found it difficult to make a decision, and how your caring and empathetic side made it difficult. So in terms of using empathy and care, was there a time where you had to make a difficult decision and those feelings of empathy and care were kind of making it difficult for you?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of little things that happen like that, even as a teacher. I mean, sometimes students mess up and you have to figure out, they've got all sorts of circumstances, real or imagined, and great stories. And you have to figure out what constitutes being, oh, I think I hear a little student somewhere. You have to figure out, how much compassion to show for them, how much leeway you can give them in terms of being fair to others. And I think that's what makes it so difficult for leaders, is that the one thing that is ethically distinctive about being a leader is when you have to make important decisions, you're not just making the decision for that moment, but you're setting all sorts of precedents for other moments. So even if it's a simple thing like my student wants to hand in a paper late, well, how I decide that is going to depend on how I'm going to decide the other cases. Because if I decide it one way for this person and another way for another, they're going to start thinking I'm showing favorites. So I think that I can have compassion for people, but sometimes I think the hardest part of leadership is you have to follow the rules, or you have to be able to have precedents. You have to be able to be morally consistent in some ways. And that's not fun, because it's sometimes not fun to say, no, sorry, I won't take your paper. You're going to get an F on it. Well, that's not happy for anybody involved. On the other hand, if I was too empathetic to everybody, I would end up making all sorts of ad hoc decisions that would be unfair to the rest of the class. So that's a type of dynamic that leaders face. And I think that's what makes it different than being a leader. There's a couple things that are totally ethically different about being in a leadership role. One of the things is you're responsible for things you don't do. So things that happen under your watch that you have nothing to do with and had no idea of. Sorry, it's your fault. In real life, if your neighbor down the street does something bad, it's not your fault. As a parent, it's the same thing. If your kid, you have young kids who do something bad, it's your fault. and to say, no, well, I wasn't there, I didn't do it. Well, sorry, doesn't work that way. So leaders and parents have a lot in common in that regard. So that's one of the things. And the other is this precedent notion, because people watch leaders very closely and they look for cues about how decisions are going to be made in the future. And so very often you have to think about that long and hard, even if you are feeling empathetic and sympathetic for other people.
Awesome. The next question is coming from Michael Buckley. And Michael asks, and it's a bit of a question, so I'm going to break this up into two sections. The first question he asks is a duty to care an example of emotional intelligence?
I actually just wrote a paper where I kind of beat up on emotional intelligence. But let's not talk about that, okay? Not among friends. No, but I think they're in some ways, they're very different things. And let me revert to the philosopher Kant, who wrote the most on the notion of duty. And what Kant says is that duties are not about following your inclinations. They're about following principles and moral laws, regardless of your inclinations. So for someone like Kant, what ethics is really about is doing the stuff you don't feel like doing, but you know you should do. He says that's what's extraordinary about ethics. If you were just a nice person all the time and always told the truth and everything, yeah, you'd be a great person and that's all perfectly fine. But the real human ethics are when you don't feel like telling the truth, you don't feel like doing certain things, but you do it because you have an obligation. And I always tell my students, it's probably the only thing they remember from me, is that for Kant, ethics has to hurt. It's not what you feel like doing. So in some ways, they're quite different. Now, emotional intelligence certainly is related to empathy, and that's important. And some people are simply better at it. My only complaint about our emotional intelligence is that it's difficult to say whether it's a different intelligence or whether it's just an area of knowledge, talent, and inclination that people have. And so Daniel Goleman, for example, says we have like tons and tons of intelligences. We have music intelligence, we have this intelligence. And so as a philosopher, again, we're kind of picky about language. So I find that somewhat complicated because everything you know isn't an intelligence. And it's just knowledge about a different thing. So I don't know if I answered your question. It was a little rambly, but you can do a follow-up if you want.
Yeah, and so Michael follows up with this section. He says, my child's school district spends a lot of time on social and emotional learning, drawing on works coming out of Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence.
Right.
And but he follows up with this question: what are your thoughts then on people's capacity to become more attuned to caring?
Oh, I mean, I think people certainly can, and especially with young people, the most important way they learn it is through literature, on the stories. Actually, I mean, if you look at great world religions, there's a whole lot of stories in them as well. I mean, part of the way children learn is through stories. They learn through things like Sesame Street. So there's a lot of visual, imaginative things going on that help them learn. It's not like somebody gives them a lecture on how to be sensitive. We learn empathy. I mean, literature is a great way to learn empathy. And it's so, I mean, I think that's how you would probably want to teach it. I don't know what they do, so I don't know enough about it to actually comment on it, but I do think you can learn to be more sensitive. And then there are some people who just aren't that sensitive, but can have a very strong sense of duty and obligation and all of those kinds of things that may not require high levels of emotional intelligence, but do require a kind of commitment to doing the right thing. So, you know, I think we have to leave room for the variety of humanity that we have out there.
I think you mentioned some of this already, but Priscilla asked, why do you think people struggle with empathy? And how can we build practices and structures grounded in empathy in our school systems?
Well, I guess the real question, people struggle with empathy because you never really know if you know how somebody feels. So there's that. And then some people simply lack the imagination to do it. And then there are some people who are just so different in circumstances that empathy is difficult, but there's still moral principles about respecting the humanity of everyone that are in play. So I could meet someone in some obscure island that's never come in contact with European world, and I could meet someone there who was so incredibly different than me. But the Dalai Lama had a great way of stating this. He said he was meeting with a journalist who said, "When you look in my eyes, what do you see?" And he started laughing and he said, "When I look in your eyes, I say, oh, another human being just like me." And if you can do that, you don't need to empathize. You just need to know we're all human beings. You may be a very different human being, different background, different ethnicity, different all sorts of things. But what's really important is we just recognize each other as human beings. I don't know if that's empathy, because we're all different, but rather just realizing we're all the same is what's really important.
Dr. Ciulla, we have a question coming from Leonie here. Do
Mhm.
you think unconscious bias shapes or influences a person's ability to be empathetic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would imagine so. Yeah, I think, well, the tricky thing about an unconscious bias is it's unconscious. And so how do you verify that it's really there? It's like Freud's unconscious intentions. I've always had a hard time with that one too, because in science, you have to have a falsifiable hypothesis. How can you falsify the fact that someone has an unconscious intention or an unconscious bias? We can do it by how they act. We could say, well, they act in very prejudicial ways, but they don't know it. Well, okay, so that might be true, but we don't know if it's conscious or unconscious. So I have a hard time with that. But yeah, I mean, if they thought they were so different, I mean, if you think you're in a different category than any other human being, that's a pretty powerful unconscious bias. That means that I can't imagine this other person being at all like me, and that's problematic. And that would be in an extreme case, but yeah, I mean, I can imagine that it'd be something worth studying, certainly.
So Dr. Ciulla, another question comes from Shanice, where she asks, how can leaders be physically present and pay attention during this new era where we're kind of working from home and we're all remote or even hybrid?
Right. Well, I mean, then you have to do it remotely. And doing it remotely is not terrible. It's the most important thing is people have to feel that you're attentive to them. And so, again, getting back to the Ukrainian president, he's on television every day. He's talking to people every day. He's telling them, not necessarily verbally, I'm paying attention to your plight. I'm paying attention to this, and people really need that. If he didn't do that, it'd be highly problematic. I think it'd be a very sad state for the country, but he's doing it extremely well. He has a really good sense of how to do it. He has a good sense of how to say it. I think maybe his theater background is serving him well. He understands he shouldn't be in a suit and tie. He understands that he has to, again, this notion of being with people. Actually, there's this marvelous book you might want to look at by Paul Woodruff called Reverence. And reverence in ancient Chinese and ancient Greek literature is considered the most important virtue for a leader. And so how do they define it? Reverence is the virtue of leaders not thinking they're gods, and reverence is the virtue of being a part of a whole. And so if we understand that, you may not understand in terms of empathy every single piece of that whole, but understanding you're part of the whole, understanding you're part of humanity is what is extremely important.
So, Dr. Ciulla, and just a follow-up to that question, have in your um, expertise in terms of leadership studies, how have you seen how leaders show up and be present change in this new remote era, or has that changed?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, well, of course, it's easier to get around. We can get places fast, so that's important. But it's kind of interesting because where it really changed a lot, and that's why the Putin story is so interesting, is because in some ways, Clinton's behavior at the Oklahoma City bombing years ago kind of set a high bar for the rest of the leaders in the world. And that's why some of these journalists are kind of amusing. Because one of the things, and I've actually met Clinton, is he really likes people. He just likes people. I mean, it's it's funny. I mean, I've seen him in settings with my family because my sister used to work with him, and you know, we're not big donors or anything like that. And you know, my mother comes up, he's got his arm around my mother, he's showing my father his golf swing, he's talking, he just likes people. And he does have he has a huge amount of empathy. So he's a really interesting guy because it kind of comes by it naturally. He likes people. He doesn't seem to have any hierarchical notions of himself and people. He likes to talk to people. He can feel the empathy. So he set an interesting norm for it. Now today, what's dangerous, and the reason why this is kind of an important consideration today, is because we can have so many virtual options. It's easy to be like Putin and say, I can sit in my office and talk to everyone. Leaders can't run off with every crisis. I mean, that would be impractical for them. But what they can do, and today I think it's an interesting challenge, is they can figure out when they need to go there. And sometimes it's good to have good staff to tell them that you need to drop everything, you need to go to the city. Mayors understand that. So any city mayor's got to show up. They don't show up. First of all, cities are smaller. But a mayor who is tempted to use virtual means, you know, if there was a big fire in New York City or something awful happened and the mayor didn't show up, that would be pretty bad. So there's a temptation to use some of these things when they shouldn't. Under COVID, obviously, people can't get around in the same way, but they still can keep communicating with people. And we saw, even though he's had his problems, I mean, Andrew Cuomo understood this in the beginning of the pandemic, that people were freaked out and they needed to have reports and they needed to have information, and he did it very well. So there are lots of great examples around of people doing it well, but for leaders like the president, it's deciding on judgment. For working in organizations, nonprofit organizations, working with other groups, there will be times when horrible things happen, and it will be appropriate for you to get there and drop everything. And that's part of being a leader, is leaders have to be ready to drop everything. It's not like they get to have, it depends on what your position is, but having work-life balance in a significant leadership role is just, if that's what you want, don't be a leader. It doesn't really work that way.
So I just want to forward through some of the really good question that just came into the chat.
Mhm.
Does childhood trauma prevent a person from being empathetic?
Well, it's more of a psychological question. It could go either way, I bet, because you could empathize with people who had a similar trauma, or it could damage you in some sort of way and do that. But I'm probably not too qualified to answer that kind of question. But we have seen people who have gone on to do quite well with traumatic childhoods, leaders that have had parents who were alcoholics or abusive or things like that, and they've gone on to be empathetic human beings. So it just, I think, depends on how you process it as a person, and that might also just have to do with personality too.
All right, and so this question is, and I'm guessing this question probably is on the tail of some of the questions about Putin, in terms of, you know, him being in office and after some time would have sort of learned to show up in the duty of caring in some form. But do you believe that And this question comes from George. Do you believe that because of the added responsibilities of a person in a position of leadership, that those responsibilities contribute to them losing their ability to be empathetic and care? Or does that rule, like, let's say in the case of Putin, generate that ability or duty to care?
Well, I think in the case of Putin, he's got a long history of, he's a consistent guy. He's had a long history of not really caring very much. I mean, he cares about some things, but one of the things that's striking about him when you look closely at his behavior as a leader is the fact that he's always somewhat isolated himself, and he's always been separate or apart from people. And COVID has exacerbated it so that he is so isolated from everything that they get isolated from reality. The other interesting challenge of leaders is when they've been in office a long time, it's very rare that leaders are in office for a long time and don't end up with some corruption. Because what happens is that you start listening to fewer and fewer people and you become isolated. And when you become isolated, you're not around people, you're not dealing with ordinary people. There was a book written years ago, I can't remember what it was called, about presidents who had children in the White House. And they were talking about how healthy that was because, you know, if you're a two-term president, you're 8 years in the White House and you don't have any children, you don't end up going out with ordinary people in the role of someone other than the president very often. So when the Obamas, they had daughters, they had to go to their daughters' schools, they had their daughters' sporting events, they had other things, there were parents there. They ended up sort of being a little bit more normal. So one of the issues I think that is related to the ability of leaders to empathize and care is their ability to maintain perspective. And that becomes harder the longer they're in power. Because, you know, you even know, you see it in business. New leader comes in and what he or she does is they go around the operation, they talk to everybody, they find out what's going on. They learn a lot about the organization, and then, you know, they're in the job for a few years and they stay in their office and they don't go out and see people, and then they lose that input. And the one thing you need for empathy is you have to have contact with people. You have to have face-to-face contact with them all the time. And, you know, we're Zooming it now, but and that's somewhat of a substitute. It's not perfect, but we're Zooming it now. But in the future, you know, how do you care about people unless you actually see them, hear them, are able to share in the problems that they have, and also, more importantly, let them know that you're sharing in their problem.
And I think that kind of answers some of our other questions in terms of how can you show that you're present? The idea of just being there, being kind of in that face-to-face mode with somebody and showing them that those ability to care and just be present. So we really appreciate all of your insight and all of your questions and all of your answers to our questions. And thank you so much for being here with us. I'm going to pass it back on to Suzette. And just thank you for answering all of our questions. We really appreciate it.
Well, they were great questions. Some of them too hard.
Thank you so much, Gabby and Dennis. You did a great job promoting your club and asking questions. So good job on your part. I want to also acknowledge the Dean of School of Ed, Renee Parma, who's on the call, and Professor Laura Roberts, who also teaches in School of Ed, who's on the call. Thank you so much for joining us. I know how long these days can be and how, you know, overwhelmed we are and tired with Zoom time. Dr. Ciulla, this was phenomenal. I want to just, you know, play this over, and you said so many really good things that we can use as leaders, as educators. So thank you for sharing. And we really do have to get you back on campus in person, so you'll see the campus. I want to also thank you, everyone, for joining us. So we are at the end of 4 long nights. Thank you, David, for sticking it out for me. He rushed home every single night, every single day after work to make sure we had this Zoom on. What we will do tomorrow actually, is I will send everyone who attended, even if you just attended one night, I'll send the recordings for every single night to you, so you'll have it and you can listen. But I want to thank you for joining us. This was really good and you asked great questions. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.